to serve a real life architect who also thinks about architecture. And he also lectures in history, theory and practice of architectural design at the University of the Witwatersrand. He currently teaches history theory courses to their 3rd and 4th years of architectural study and coordinates the final year M.Arch design and thesis at Wits. He holds a B.Arch professional and an M.Arch in independent research, both from Wits. He has a PhD from the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College London, and is author of a book, African Identity in Post-Apartheid Public Architecture, Black Skin, White Masks, published by Ashgate in 2011. And we look forward to hearing what you have to share with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, firstly, I'd like to say it's a tremendous joy and indeed a privilege to be able to come here tonight and share probably an hour or so with you and to speak. I really appreciate having the opportunity. And I think it's a wonderful thing that University of Pretoria have done in this lecture series, and it provides a very wonderful opportunity for members of the profession, academics and students to meet and to hear about certain themes that are important. I was given a little bit of a brief in terms of the idea for these lectures, and I noted there was something about tradition and something about modernity, and so I decided to talk on this topic, architecture, historicism and historiography, which is a long-standing interest of mine. And to start the talk, I want to look at a few words, because I think we need to be clear on the meaning of these terms, history, historicism, and historiography. And I thought perhaps we could start by just having a little bit of audience participation. So let's take the first word, history, and maybe there's some people here who'd like to say what they understand from the term. So, anyone just going to write that? Anyone? Any takers? Yeah.
Story written by men.
Okay. Fair enough. And anyone else like to add? Maybe we can just take 2 or 3. Yes?
A specific version of past events.
Okay, a specific version of past events. Yes?
Memory.
A memory. Okay, that's fantastic. So we, in my lecture, I agree with what everyone has said. In my lecture, I want to distinguish between a notion of the past, which is what happened, and a notion of history, which is not quite the same as the past, because the history is what we say of the past, either through oral forms or through written forms. And I also, in my lecture, am making a distinction between history with a capital H and history with a lower case h. And in the uppercase, we are referring to grand sweeping histories. For example, in architecture, the history which we might trace from the Egyptians to the Greeks, to the Romans, through the Middle Ages, on to the European Renaissance, and so forth. So that would be uppercase history, a sweeping, large-scale history, versus history in the lowercase h, which is a much more focused and detailed history. So, for example, we might take one architect in one period and study his or her work in elaborate detail. Okay, so let's look at this term, this word, historicism. Any takers on historicism? No one.
The reinterpretation of the history of the past.
The reinterpretation of the history of the past. Okay. Anyone else want to add? Okay, I have 2 meanings for the word. The first is really the idea that we can achieve an objective account of human history. Historicism is, in a sense, the belief that the historian can transport us back in time and that we can represent history in the most objective way possible. Okay? So it's a form of history that aims at objectivity. But the other meaning of the word that we commonly use, we also use historicism to describe modes of design where historical styles, such as Gothic, classical, or whatever for that matter, are applied to buildings. This too is said to be a form of historicism. And of course, these two ideas are indeed related. Okay, let's take the third term, historiography. Any takers on what this word signifies? Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure, but history of a place, a certain place.
Okay, yeah.
Isn't it the study of history, study of the development of history and the methodology of history?
Yeah, pretty much.
I was going to say just the writing of history, in other words, methods of writing history.
Yes, yes. Once again, we actually land up with two meanings for the term. The one goes to precisely the methods, the techniques, the theories that are used when one constructs a historical account. And the other meaning of the term goes to the body of historical writings. That we have, and we use the terms in that way. Now, modern historicism is really this attempt to go back in time to understand it the way it was. And the big question for us this evening is to ask whether that is in fact possible. Is it possible to know the past without imposing any interest which is centered in our present? Keith Jenkins, I'm jumping ahead of myself. This slide is to show you the map of my talk. Perhaps I should just explain that. I'm starting, number one, with the question of history and narrative. I already jumped in there. I apologize. I'm going to start with the question of history and narrative, and we're going to look at how narrative structures are used to create history. Then I'm going to ask the question, why we have an interest in history, and it is here that I want to talk to the question of histories in the uppercase, looking at the notion of the origin and of the emergence. And then thirdly, the third point in my talk, I want to revisit the idea of history in the lowercase, which is what I believe to be the most common form of history that we are now involved with, and ask a few questions about that. So that's more or less the structure of my talk. So you see, we're starting with this. Keith Jenkins, in his book, The Postmodern History Reader, provides an excellent account of readings that introduce contemporary debates over the question of history. And the contemporary debate that has been raging is more or less hinged between a modern defense of historicism, which believes we can have an objective history, versus a postmodern critique of the same. And a really excellent property of Jenkins' book is the fact that he has dug up really good essays from leading thinkers on both sides of the debate. And I think if you took up this reader and you spent a bit of time with it, I think it would challenge and change your understanding of what history is. In a nutshell, the postmodern position, which is the one that Jenkins himself supports, argues that an objective history simply is not possible, that history never was objective and never will be, and that there is always some form of ideological bias. And this critique centers upon a distinction between the past as an actual occurrence, which we might say is preserved in evidence, and the historical narrative that is used to tell the story of what happened. Now, just because there are a bunch of facts that exist out there does not necessarily mean that there is a narrative that joins them. And a leading point that Jenkins makes in the introduction to his book is that historians have all too commonly conflated empiricism with realism. Now, empiricism would concern the establishing of the evidence from which we will construct the history. And realism is concerned with an account of what really happened. Jenkins paraphrases MacLennan with the following quotation. Empiricism is not entailed by realism. It only appears as if empiricism is a property of realism. Therefore, from the acceptance of the ontological actuality of the past, no epistemology or method of any kind whatsoever necessarily follows. In other words, upon accepting that there was a past and that things actually did happen, there is nothing in that acceptance that will produce for us a method in terms of the way we approach knowledge as to how we should understand that past. In other words, empiricism doesn't give us an epistemology. Empiricism as a method just cannot account for the significance it gives to the selection, distribution, and weighting of the facts in finished narratives. The facts cannot themselves indicate their significance as though it were inherent in them. And another quotation from Hayden White: there is an inexpugnable relativity in every representation of historical phenomena. The relativity of the representation is a function of the language used to describe and thereby constitute past events as possible objects of explanation and understanding. In other words, it is through empirical study that we establish the evidence and what might be called the historical facts of the case, but it's through language and narrative that we achieve the sense of realism that enables those facts to speak to us. Realism is really the construct of language and does not issue directly from the collecting of evidence. Now, this conflation of empiricism and realism is in fact very convenient, because it precisely obscures the narrative structure that constructs the devices of the historical account. We know that history is a narrative, but this fact has not been well considered by historians until fairly recently. So, this being the case, in what way does narrative produce history? And I want to consider 3 points in terms of the way narrative works to construct history. The first is selecting and combining, and then I will look at the status of evidence, and then lastly at the question of interpretation, perspective, and theory. So let's go to the first issue, selecting and combining. Look, it's simply not possible to write an account of everything that happened in human history. And this is so because of what we might call the near infinite density of human existence. And what I mean by that density are the thoughts, the feelings, the actions, the desires that make up our human world. The only reliable way to capture everything would be to hit rewind and play the whole saga all over again. Well, we both know that's not going to happen. But the real point is actually even more important. Even if we could hit rewind and replay the historical enactment, it would not, in any case, produce a history that would be comprehensible or intelligible for us. The blunt truth of the matter is that the past, in order to be rendered comprehensible, must be represented through a history that simplifies and domesticates the past it claims to capture. So, our historian, she must get out into the field and find the evidence. And there's always going to be bits of evidence that are missing, but she must get the evidence she can get. And she must decide which portions of the evidence are important. She must select the elements that she's going to write about. And finally, she must construct a narrative that joins the bits of evidence up into a comprehensible piece of writing. Now, immediately, we've encountered two levels of interpretation. Firstly, in selecting what one will write about, one was already reading into those things their significance. So selection is already a form of interpretation. And obviously, connecting the bits of evidence up together in a narrative is suggestive of causality or link or relationship between these things, and that too is a second level of interpretation. From this, I think we must surely see that the import of the evidence is really the significance that the narrative brings to bear upon it. Because the narrative is precisely the act of selecting and combining. Now, this realization introduces a very interesting question as to what constitutes an historical event. Look, lots of things happen, right? In fact, you can say that many things happen all the time. But not everything that happens is deemed to be a historical event. When we read historical accounts, we soon see that events are marked by dates, they get concretized through images and verbal descriptions, and so on. And it is often quite possible to tell the same story, or more or less the same story, by selecting different events. As a matter of fact, I think it's possible to tell more or less the same story and to do it with the same ideological intention and still select different facts to achieve the narrative. So I think we are led to conclude that it is the historian's narrative that confers the status of an event upon that which happened and not the other way around. Then, of course, it's also possible to tell lies and invent evidence that doesn't exist, and that exists in its own case entirely. All right, I'd like to now talk about the question of the status of evidence. We've been talking about facts, and we've been talking about evidence, and there can be no doubt that there is a historical substance in the form of archaeology, photographs, eyewitness accounts, diaries, documents, texts of various kinds. And one might assume that the evidence, at least, is clear and objectifiable, and it's only really the historian's narrative that introduces the ideological slant, and this is hardly an unusual view. Unfortunately, however, it's not so simple. In many cases, written evidence is the best and most useful kind of evidence. Let's say, for example, we're trying to reconstruct a building, we've got a bunch of archaeological fragments, literally ruins from the past, and when we study these ruins, frankly, we're guessing, because the building's not there, we've got a few fragments, we're scratching our heads trying to understand what the building looked like. But if we could find a diary, an eyewitness account of someone who actually saw the building and wrote about it, I think now we've got a piece of evidence which is very useful. But of course, the big hitch here, which I'm sure you're all noting,
is the fact that the written account is already embedded in a narrative. So everything we've said about the construction of narrative already applies. Look, in terms of post-structural theory, we can say that there are no discursive facts, because what we call evidence is already constituted within a discursive field of deemed significance and therefore of prior interpretation. Once again, I'm not saying that we can just invent evidence, and I'm not suggesting that the historian should be irresponsible in his or her use of evidence. And I think we would expect an academic history to be one which studies all possible forms of evidence, and to study that evidence as openly and honestly and as thoroughly as one can. Alright, so I'm now going to move on to this third point concerning interpretation, perspective, and theory. And really, this third point follows from the previous two. I think we can see that history is deeply interpretive. And by the same token,